You're listening to episode 337 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Shaila Catherine returns to the podcast to speak about her new book, Beyond Distraction: 5 Practical Ways to Focus the Mind. Hi, everyone. You may have noticed this podcast has been on pause. After 10 years of weekly episodes, this, or present moment mindfulness, I needed a break to shift my focus to teaching. There will be occasional releases like today's new episode, and I'm very happy to break the silence with Shaila Catherine. Shaila has practiced meditation since 1980, studied with founders of Western Insight Meditation Centers, and accumulated more than 9 years of silent retreat experience. Shaila loves deep meditation and appreciates a variety of approaches to exploring, developing, and liberating the mind. So sit back, relax, and have a nice chai honey tea. And our guest today, returning to the podcast, is Shaila Catherine. Welcome back. So good to see you. It's only been a decade. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me back.
I'm so glad to have you here. And well, we've got some, for me, exciting news about what we're going to be talking about today, but I'm wondering if you could just catch us up on the past 10 years. You've had some projects that have been going on, and we're going to talk about one of those specifically in a little bit, but let's catch us up a little bit on what you've been doing for the past few years.
Sure. I think when we talked into 2012, we talked mostly about concentration and jhana practice, and I had written 2 books on the subject. I was continuing for a few years practicing in that mode, giving a lot of emphasis to deep samadhi and concentration practice, and studying with Venerable Palak Sayadaw. And over time, I wanted to broaden my explorations, did more satipatthana practice, and explored other things. And as I continued to deepen both my concentration and insight, I was so aware of the main hindrance simply being deluded thoughts. Yeah. The other hindrances seem like they would fall away or not even arise. But those little niggly, wispy, deluded thoughts were quite persistent in my own mind. And certainly I saw that as a predominant theme as I was teaching samadhi and concentration and jhana retreats with students. And there's there are teachings in the Middle Link discourses that are very practical on this subject, on how to work with distracting thoughts. It wasn't like we're the only ones who think and are struggling with that. Back in the Buddhist time, they did too, and he spoke directly to it. And so I wanted to work very systematically and explicitly with those strategies that the Buddha taught. So I started playing with them in my own practice. I started incorporating them into my retreats. I put together some courses on the subject and was playing with them for a number of years, really wanting to write a book on the subject, but I didn't have time.
Yeah.
It takes time to sit down and to carve out the time to write, to
Mhm.
not be interrupted with and preparing for a teaching on another subject or a retreat on this topic or that topic, but to just really focus. And I kept saying, oh, I want to write this book, but I don't have time. I want to write this book, but I don't have time. I just don't have time. If I have a chunk of time, I want to take it in retreat.
Yeah. And your books they're not light reading. They're really, really rich, densely populated with important information and practice books. This is
Well,
not something that you're going to see at the newsstand that you can get like some of those short magazines. Like, no, this is really in depth and comprehensive. That's one of the wonderful things I like about your books. So that when you talk about it's a lot to write a book, yes, it really is, to the degree to which you honor the subject.
Well, thank you. I consider that a compliment, because to me, if I'm going to write something, I don't want it to be, and it's not, I don't want it to be painful. So I hope it's light enough that people can engage with it and not find it burdensome. But I want it to be really rich and in depth. I want it to be worth somebody's time
Mhm.
um, to really spend with it. But when the pandemic hit, my whole teaching schedule was kind of turned upside down. Retreats were canceled. And guess what? I had the time. So this book became my pandemic project.
Yeah. So you started then within the past couple of years, it would be a fairly recent one as of this recording. For folks who may be joining later, we're still in a pandemic. We're into year 2, I think, at this point. And one of the things, so, I was kind of curious, your previous books have been more focused on concentration practice, on jhana, and that this is a little bit of a shift in topic. And I was wondering what caused that shift. And you've described that very well. It's like this would happen in your own practice, and with the participants in your programs would run into this too. You described a few different ways in which you would write courses about this, and ways in which you play with it in your own practice. So I'm kind of curious, as you were coming up with, okay, I'm going to write a book, and having seen what you have in there, how it aligns with what the Buddha said about these distractions and working with them. What were some of the things that, as you were putting the book together, because that's a different kind of process, that gave you maybe a different perspective on some of the things that you or your students were running into? What were some of the things that might have shown up as you were digging through the dirt, so to speak, of this topic? What were some of the gems you uncovered?
Well, I initially began with the interest of how um, those distracting thoughts are the main hindrance to concentration. So initially, I began with it as a reflection on, well, what is the main obstruction for people who want to do deep concentration and jhana practice?
Mhm.
Let's go directly to those issues, because when I teach a jhana retreat, I have to assume that people know how to deal with the hindrances already. Because if I spent the retreat teaching the hindrances, I would never get to the jhana instructions. But that's a rather huge assumption,
It's a
that
big part.
everybody can like settle the hindrances immediately. But the first kind of the criteria for what an absorption is that all those discursive thoughts have ended,
Mhm.
have completely ended. Not that they're just wispy in the background and we're not developing them, but they've actually ended. It's an extraordinary state of mind to have that thought-free experience. So I started looking at, well, what were those wispy thoughts? How were we, what were the causes for their arising? How do we deal with them when they arise? They're not always unwholesome. Sometimes they're about dharma or about adjusting the practice, but nevertheless, they keep activating the
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah.
So initially, I was thinking about it in terms of of the obstruction to samadhi and concentration. But as I got involved in the writing and the teaching of this system, it became really clear how incredibly practical they are for daily activities, for our relationships, for the way that we make decisions, for the rumination that sometimes keeps people up at night, for the way that we see and learn how our mind works in relationship to the impacts of the day, the sensory things that we encounter, the activities that we do. They all have a kind of they reverberate in our minds, and they come back in the form of thoughts, and we play with them, and then we construct a sense of identity through those stories. So I realized that working with these thoughts was far more important than just learning how to set them aside and establish deep concentration, but we're really learning how the mind works, how identity forms, and we're focusing on that fetter of restlessness and recognizing it as a fetter, as the mind keeps moving and turning things into its own advantage, grabbing a hold of this and making it, giving it a meaning, and then building an identity around it. And that keeps us not necessarily, they're not necessarily evil thoughts, but they're deluded thoughts. So it gives a way to work with delusion and restlessness in sort of more exploring them rather than just cutting them off.
Yeah. And you described this so eloquently. It's one of the wonderful things I enjoy about talking with you, Shaila, is this idea that thoughts are not necessarily the enemy here. It's not that the thoughts are evil. The thoughts may be about dharma. They may be about adjustments to practice, but there is still an activity in the mind that, for what we're doing here, for example, a jhana practice, a concentration practice, and an indistractability, that still disrupts that, and even when they are of those more wholesome or skillful kinds of thoughts. So in working with that, are there different ways in which, because you do go through 5 practical ways, and you're very right, they are very practical applications, and not just in formal practice, but in daily life. Is there a nuance? Is there a bit of a shifting depending on the kind of thought? Or is it all really just, well, this is rooted in selfing, or this is promoting of selfing, and so we work with it the same way, whether it's about a laundry list, or I need to adjust my practice, or gosh, I'm really angry about something?
Yeah, no, I think we can be sensitive to the type of thought that's arising, how deeply it's integrated into our identity, how strongly we cling to it, basically, and what the kind of an effect is. So I don't think we should treat all thoughts as completely equal. In a way, I can see the perspective that they are, because they're all just thoughts.
Right.
A thought, it's just a thought. It's a discrete mental event. It arises in the mind. But that's not to equalize all thoughts, because their impact is different. They impact our condition, they cause us to say different things, to do different things, and they feel quite different. They impact the quality of our minds differently and condition our karmic kind of stream differently. If we entertain a lot of angry thoughts, that's gonna have a different effect than entertaining thoughts of how to respond skillfully in the next thing we say. One will incline towards compassionate, clear speech. The other will probably incline towards an outburst. So they're different, and we can see those differences while still knowing it's just a thought. And when I investigate thoughts, almost all of them do come back to this construction of identity.
Yeah.
We build a sense of who we are, and we form our stories. And sometimes we need to work at that deep level. But we don't always work at that deep level. Sometimes we just, and how exhausting it would always be if every time we had a thought, we had to get to the root of selfing in it. I mean, sure, that's one great approach, but we can be flexible, we can be skillful, we can have a wide range of approaches.
Yeah, we
There are a
don't need
lot of
to.
thoughts that we just set aside or that we replace with a different kind of thoughts.
Right. Yeah.
There are some thoughts that we just want to have a different attitude towards.
Yeah, a different way of receiving what's here. We don't need to replant the entire garden if there's one weed. We could maybe work on that weed and not have to go to the root every single time, because that would be exhausting if
Yeah.
every time there is a particular kind of thought showing. I was like, oh, nope, got to throw out all the dirt, all the plants, everything.
And I like the idea that you're saying one weed, because that's what sometimes happens with identification.
Yeah.
People have one kind of nasty thought, and then, or one sort of, uh, yeah, one disturbing thought. And then they feel so ashamed of themselves for having that thought that they build they actually reinforce that thought through the shame that I had that. And it gives too much power to that thought.
Yeah.
That was just one little bubble that arose in a fizzy drink, so to speak. There's like lots of it's just one little thought that could come and go. What we do with them, which ones we pick out, how we react to them, is really what's significant, because thoughts arise due to such myriad conditions.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can't just control whatever thought is going to arise. Yes, we can influence the patterns that we reinforce.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we have no control over this. I do think we participate in the patterns that we develop in our lives. But nevertheless, we don't control the thought that just arose.
Yeah. Yeah. It shows up as part of our experience in the moment, and there may or may not be a mental proliferation around that adding on of the judgments and the thoughts about it, so that the one little thought, which, yeah, just a thought, at that point, just a thought, the word just is appropriate, can then, through this proliferation, the fizzy drink, I really like that. There's, oh, suddenly lots and lots of bubbles here, because that's how proliferation works, as it just keeps going. And so the practice in helping to notice that one bubble, that one wispy thought early on, before it becomes an entire big fizzy difficult drink to flatten out.
Yeah, and when it's just a thought, then we can look at it and we can also see the conditioning below it that it came out of, without being so disturbed by it. So we have a balanced, mindful attitude, some degree of equanimity. Oh, look at that thought. We're even happy that we saw it. So rather than being horrified that it arose, it becomes interesting. Oh, wow, look at that thought. That just arose. What's a skillful, maybe the thing to do is nothing. Maybe the thing to do is to replace it. Maybe it would be skillful to understand its causes. Maybe, there's a lot of possibilities if we can just see, oh, look at that, with a skillful attitude.
Yeah. And that itself is one of the things that our practice can be very helpful with, is the noticing what's here now, early on, when it's still this light wispy thing that we can work with. There's often a challenge sometimes with spiritual bypassing or avoidance or suppression, maybe of an unpleasant thought, something that may have some associations that are not wanted, and there can be an avoidance and not working with, or even being with that, and sometimes not even seeing that thought is here. I'm wondering if that is something you ever run into, either with your students or maybe in your own practice, that tendency of aversion that may show up as suppression or avoidance. Is that something that tends to show up sometimes?
I think it's
thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's really common with thoughts, especially thoughts that are hateful or ugly or vengeful, or shame, somehow trigger shame, or are thoughts that are in some way or other kind of socially taboo. We don't want anybody to think we thought that. And then, or they just don't feel like they're spiritual enough. like maybe somebody, many thoughts are just the replay and the reorganization of input that we had. So maybe somebody watched some shows on TV and they find themselves replaying some show from television, and it's a little too embarrassing to admit that this spirit, we're trying to be some spiritual person. So we may not want to say, yeah, I just spent the last 45 minutes in my meditation thinking about episode 6 of whatever. So they might not be really like, that's what I mean. They might not be evil, but still they can not hold up to the self-image we might want to project. And in that way, we might feel a little bit embarrassed by it.
Yeah.
Or we might have something more strongly embarrassing.
Right. And the selfing piece comes into this. You're right. It keeps coming back to the I in this eye of the storm.
This whole investigation, though, has to be done in the light of mindfulness, supported by mindfulness. It's about observing. So it's about seeing the mind just as it is. And when we're willing to see the mind, it's not so scary. It's just, wow, look at that. Look at that conditioning. And so it's almost like we're letting our thoughts be exposed, at least to ourselves, honestly. So suppression has no place in this. There are, maybe I could say a little bit of the specific strategies to give to ground.
I was just going to ask about, yes, perfect timing. Yes, please.
And I base this training sequence and this book that's called Beyond Distraction. I base it upon a few discourses that we find in the middling discourses of the Buddha. So we're looking at very early teachings. And in one teaching, the Buddha talks about first noticing 2 kinds of thoughts: the thoughts that tend to lead to harm, and the thoughts that tend to lead to well-being. So the more traditional language would be wholesome or unwholesome, or skillful or unskillful, or profitable or unprofitable. The Pali terms are kusala and akusala. I tend to use wholesome and unwholesome, but none of them are really great English terms. They all have kind of baggage to them, judgmental baggage. But we know if something is rooted in greed, hate, and delusion and is going to lead to greater harm. And we know when something is rooted in compassion and kindness and wisdom and is really going to lead to well-being. So that's what we're trying to get at, is we need to look at our minds and say, okay, this thought is helpful and this thought is hurtful. So we recognize that. We don't need to elaborate, oh, I'm a great person, I'm such a spiritual person, and I'm a horrible person. We just see, oh, that's the character, that's the inclination of this thought and the inclination of that thought. So we first discern what are called the 2 kinds of thoughts. And then most of the strategies are for that class of thoughts that we know is going to cause trouble. Those habitual thought patterns that just keep going around in our minds and leading away from our well-being for ourselves, for the people that we interact with, and for the whole world. So, because I really do think the thoughts that we entertain create the patterns that affect our speech and affect our actions or our inactions. So I really do feel like it seems so internal to deal with our thoughts, but that's where the roots of greed, hate, and delusion are. So if we can turn our attention to that, then we're really working with a rich territory. So the next strategies are focused primarily on those thoughts that cause trouble. And there are other thoughts that won't cause much trouble. Thoughts of generosity, thoughts of compassion, thoughts of wisdom, or thoughts that this is just how it is. We're just those like factual thoughts. They're not problems. We need to be able to think. We need to be able to strategize. We need to be able to plan and decide and analyze. Those aren't the capacity to think is this beautiful human ability. So many of those thoughts, they're not a problem. The question just is, are we obsessed by them, and do they occupy all our energy, or are they being able to be used skillfully? So the strategies, though, focus not so much on those thoughts that we're using skillfully. They focus on the thoughts that seemed to control us, that we seemed to be at the mercy of, that arise and we are overwhelmed by or obsessed by. And there's a sequence of 5 strategies that the Buddha talked about. And just quickly to give them brief words so people know what I'm talking about. The first one is to replace. The second is to examine the danger. The third is to ignore or forget. The fourth is to investigate the causes. And the fifth is to bring in resolve or determination. So we have 5 strategies. And the first one is just, is you get some kind of a thought kind of looping around in your mind, and you want to turn your attention to something else. If you're giving your attention to something and it just keeps triggering that, well, take a break, go look at something else, talk about something else, change the subject. So just as we might in a conversation change a subject if it keeps stimulating, say, anger or conflict, we might take a different direction or something. We can change the subject in our own minds. And that's not to avoid difficult things. It's to be able to develop the flexibility. And all meditators learned to do this. You focus your attention on one thing. And when you wander off, you bring the attention back. Even if you're doing a spacious, relaxed, open practice, you're still developing that skill. You're aware of what's present. When the mind goes to fantasy, you bring the attention back to what's present, which might be fantasizing, but it's not lost in the story. Right. So at least all the meditation practices that I've ever done work with this strategy. You are able to shift one obsession, you shift out of the obsession and focus on something else. You replace an unwholesome thought with a wholesome one. So that's sort of the most common one. And we do that all the time in life. But the thing is it doesn't always work.
Yeah. That's why we have 5 strategies and not just one.
Exactly.
There needs to be a portfolio of ways to work with this.
Exactly. And the Buddha walks us through them. If that didn't work and you still find your mind obsessed with that, then look to see the danger of it. What's causing the trouble? What's the where is that leading? Because I hear this all the time with restlessness, that many people think there's nothing wrong with letting the mind wander. There's nothing wrong with fantasizing about this or that. There's nothing wrong, well, it's not the most evil thing in the world, but what is the danger? So, for example, just allowing the mind to wander through in fantasy when we're driving along the freeway. Very common. I would be willing to bet that almost everybody driving along the freeway, their mind is wandering. But what is the danger? Yeah. Well, there can be accidents, there's inattention, but also just from the spiritual point of view, we're lost in a world of fantasy instead of being mindful and present. So we're disconnected from that moment of life. We're not in that moment remembering the potential that we have to be free, to liberate the mind, to awaken, or at least be mindful and present to what's really happening. So we can look at the danger. Of course, thoughts of hate have more intensive dangers. Thoughts of lust could cause somebody to do something. There's other thoughts that people can do that can lead to actions that one would really later regret. But even the innocuous ones of just letting the mind wander during a task If we reflect, we see the danger, and that can then inspire somebody to want to work more, want to work more clearly and refine their ability to discern thoughts and work skillfully with them. Do you want me to mention the other ones, or?
Yeah, if you're willing, that would be terrific.
Sure. The ignore is, sometimes people think, ignore? You just said to be mindful. Now you're telling me to ignore? But the Buddha talked about skillfully avoiding certain dangers, skillfully ignoring or forgetting certain things. This is not repression. It's not suppression.
Right.
It's not a denial. It's a skill in what we attend to. It's being able to turn our attention away from something that we know by attending to it is damaging. So we're not only able to replace something, but with an unwholesome thought with the wholesome one. This is the another component, which is to be able to replace something, we have to be able to withdraw our attention so it doesn't get its hooks in us, so to speak. And if, of course, if this was the only strategy somebody used and they just went about life ignoring, that's not going to be useful. But in a sequence of strategies, this is an interesting one, is to be able to cultivate a skillful application of the mind. And we all have selective attention. There are things we give attention to and things that we don't. So can we bring this selective attention more consciously into our spiritual development so that we can use our minds both in activities and in relationships more skillfully? Yeah, like some people know if they don't like something, if they don't like somebody for one reason, they tend to notice a lot of faults about them, right?
Yep. Yeah.
You have one negative judgment and it proliferates to all the possible things that are wrong with their person. And sometimes it can be really helpful to withdraw the attention from the negative traits and then try to highlight something good about that person and create some kind of a balance so that we can meet the person as a person, because we all have faults. Right. So that's one way that the first strategy of replacing works well with the third strategy of the ignoring.
Yeah, and this ignoring, and it's important to note on this one, because I've run into this being a source of confusion for students about the ignore, that this is avoidance. I'm like, no, it's different in that avoidance there's an element of passive acceptance to avoidance. With this, it's different. This is an active way of diffusing the power of that thought. It is a very active process. It's not one where you're just turning away and it's still there. It's like, no, this is a way to pull that weed. And it is done in complement with replacement. That can be another adjunct to really do. It's not just pulling the weed, it's also planting something else. But if you just plant something else and the weed's still there, how about planting something else and also doing the weeding? So understand, this is not a passive turning away, la, 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 I cannot hear you, fingers in the ears. This is an active process of extinguishing that thought. So there's an important difference there with this one.
I think you said it really beautifully with this diffusing the power of that thought. And sometimes people don't realize how much, just by giving attention to something, it subtly gives it power and feeds it. And if we don't have the ability to withdraw that attention, then we're going to find ourselves just caught in rumination cycles and anxiety producing scenarios. We have to be able to step back. And the interesting thing is, when we can step back, it creates the ability to then look deeper. If we can't step back, we can't look deep, because we'll get sucked in. But if we can step back, then we can investigate deeply and see what the causes of those thoughts are.
Mhm.
So, and that's the fourth step, because each step, it gives us the skill to be able to go to the next step.
Mhm.
And so they work really nicely then together.
So I'm curious about what some of the biggest challenges that your students tend to have in working with thoughts. Maybe some of the bigger challenges you run into in your own practice. What are ones that have come up that have been persistent? I'm imagining that they tend to have a theme, and it may vary wildly between individual. The particular kinds of thoughts for one person are a different kind of difficult thoughts for another person. So I'm curious, what are some things that students may typically run into, some common ones that show up a lot?
I do think individuals are very different, and thoughts are they're quite intimate. And I say frequently, don't take your thoughts personally, but nevertheless, they're intimate in the sense that they're very personal. And they feel that way. They're close to somebody's identity, is the pattern of their mind. So I do think individuals are quite different. Um, some thoughts are extremely painful, like angry thoughts, hateful thoughts, um, because they burn the mind, and then they reinforce a kind of righteous justification for that anger. And they create very maybe energized states, but very painful states. So some people have to work with thoughts of anger, of I'm right, of judgment and criticism, and catch those thoughts and really look to see what the base are they even true? To just see the level of of fiction or of opinion that is in thoughts that we build so much around, and be willing to feel the effects of anger on us, and to watch how anger and hate distort the capacity of clear thinking. So sometimes with people who have a strong judgmental tendency, or have a tendency towards anger and aversion as a kind of a common theme, they'll have to work a lot with the judging thoughts, and really sense the pain of it and the potential um, to find ease
Mhm.
in that, so that they can not feed it, be at ease. Because if there's no ease, if there's no willingness to see it, then there's aversion to having aversion. There's judging ourselves for judging. And that's just more of the same cycle. So we have to shift the energy to be able to see our pattern. And there are some times when we have to have the fifth strategy, which is the resolve and the determination not to keep feeding something. I do once in a while get somebody who doesn't have much flexibility with all the strategies, and they see a thought and then they kind of like pound it away with a kind of an aggressive resolve, and just like pushing it away, pushing it away, pushing it away, pushing it away. There can be a real powerful, the fifth strategy of resolve allows us to say a powerful no to thoughts, but we can only skillfully apply that if there is no aversion in the mind, because we can't just be averse to the thoughts arising. We have to have already understood it. And then we just say, I'm not feeding that one anymore.
Mhm.
And we actually mean it. So we don't have to yell it at the top of our lungs to ourselves. We just say no. And it's simply no. It's a boundary that we set, not hate. So I sometimes have students who have been able to develop some kind of like consistency with their meditation practice by putting forth a lot of energy to concentrate or to investigate or to do, but it's exhausting. So for those people, I really want them to work with the earlier strategies, because the Buddha suggested we don't go to the higher strategies until we've applied the first ones.
Mhm.
So some people really have to work with and to trust those subtler ones, and not just work with their minds with that kind of blunt object of mental power. Um, but then I find many students don't bring forth the persistence and the energy to keep working with the mind. So they might work with the first strategy, and after it doesn't work, give up,
Mm.
and then just fantasize the rest of the rest of their meditation or the rest of their day. Or they don't bring in the investigation to really watch the mind throughout the day. I mean, how powerful, how incredible it is to bring mindfulness to the mind throughout a day in ordinary life.
Right.
I mean, I challenge everyone that's listening to this to try that. Wake up in the morning and really commit to watching your states of mind. Even write them down. I mean, every couple of minutes, you're going to probably be having a different state of mind and a different kind of thoughts. And if you even wrote down your thoughts, I'll bet you would probably decide that a good number of them aren't even true. They're not even real, or they're not based on information that you actually have. It's fascinating to see, really look closely over a sustained period, what's going on in our minds. And then when we actually see it, then we can start to work really more skillfully with it and sustain the interest to work skillfully until we are no longer at the mercy of unwholesome thoughts, but we can actually direct our minds on what the sutta calls being a master of one's mind. There's a great line in one of these discourses that says that one will be a master of the courses of thought. One will be able to think whatever thought one wants to think, and not think any thought one does not wish to think.
Mm.
Isn't that extraordinary?
Wonderful. Yes.
Now, Now, I'm not sure that everybody is going to listen to this podcast, spend one day watching their minds, and then all of a sudden never think another thought they don't want to think. But the possibility of realizing that um, we just don't have to be at the mercy of unwholesome thoughts. We can guide the development of our minds.
Mhm.
And if we then want to pursue a line of thinking, we will have the resources to be able to go deeply in that direction without distraction. And if we find the mind going off into some unwholesome thought, we can guide it back to something useful and not find ourselves just tortured by thoughts of greed, hate, and delusion, lust, anger, and ignorance that sometimes people struggle with. Um, when I'm teaching concentration retreats, by the time somebody comes to a retreat focused on concentration, most of the time, the thoughts that they struggle with are just those restless, deluded thoughts. The thoughts of conceit, the thoughts of self, the thoughts of how am I doing? Those subtle thoughts that compare in order to build up a sense of self. So they're not strong anger and lust. Most of the time, they're just this background of deluded things, the impacts of what's going on in our family, what we should do to help or not do, what somebody said to us and what did they mean about it. How am I gonna how am I going to organize my life and my finances and deal with my taxes and the faucet that's leaking? And what about the movie that I saw, or the TV program, or the book that I read, or what's happening in the news, and blah 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 blah. So it's sort of life. We get the impact from all the senses and all throughout our days, and then the mind kind of turns all of that over, and some things crystallize into thoughts that get repeated, and a lot just falls away. And when we develop a more skill with our thoughts, we will be able to influence what thoughts get space in our minds and what thoughts are not worth our time. And we just let go and don't feed in our minds. And I think that kind of being a master of one's mind is really important. I hope most people take some steps in that direction, because so much suffering occurs just in our own minds. I mean, some people suffer terribly, and yet they're in a warm house with comfortable clothes and plenty of food and a nice cat and friends. But the worry, the anxiety, the fear, the judgment, the anger, the aversion is torturous. And working with these kinds of strategies, I think, can go a long way to helping people improve the condition of their minds.
Thank you so much for that overview of this. And it is an overview, again, for folks who are listening here. If you haven't had the opportunity to read one of Shaila's books, now's a really good opportunity on this, because it does go in depth. And we've had a wonderful conversation here, so you have a little bit of an idea of that framework. But there's more to just that structure. There's stuff in there. The grist is in that. So please do check that out. Again, if you're listening to this podcast, on the episode page, I'll have a link to the book there. And Shaila, I'm wondering if you could describe, if people want to find out more about you and your works, where should they go?
Oh, sure. I do want to say that in my books, I have lots of like exercises. So it's not just a theoretical book. People will find reflections and exercises to apply in their daily life activities, and also to support their meditative development with a mindfulness-based meditation. So I think that's something that I do in all of my books, because I really like to explore things. I think we have to keep our practice interesting over years, over decades, over our whole lives. And periodically, and that's not just about like following a technique. It's about exploring the mind. And so the exercises, I think, are really interesting. And I still like to do them myself. I pick a theme and want to watch that for, some days or weeks in my life or in my practice. And it just keeps the investigation and the mindfulness going over decades. So if people are interested in finding out more about what I do, what I teach, there are 3 websites I can point you to. ShailaCatherine.com has kind of an overview. And bodhicourses.org is where I offer online courses on various themes of insight meditation, concentration and jhana practices. And those are organized as online programs. And then I founded a nonprofit in Silicon Valley, where I live in California, and it's called Insight Meditation South Bay, imsb.org. And there I offer retreats, and there are teachings and sitting groups and various things. So people can find me in many ways. But I would, I always welcome new people, and I enjoy meeting people who are sincerely interested in cultivating the mind and training the mind, in deepening concentration for the purpose of liberating insight, for the potential that the Buddha taught, that we actually can free our minds from the causes of suffering. It's something we can do. It's something that we can move toward. So I hope that my work, both in writing and teaching, offers some contribution and support to that aim.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here. And those of you who've been listening, our guest today is Shaila Catherine. We'll have a few links on the episode page. Shaila, thanks for being here. Good to see you again.
Okay, thank you. Great to talk with you.
Thanks for listening.
If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.